Hey, welcome AP Bio. This is going to be a little mini lecture on speciation and extinction. So we're going to be learning about how you make a new species and then of course what causes some of these species to go extinct. So let's go ahead and get started. Before we move on to how new species are actually created, it's important that you have a good understanding of what a species is. So a species is a group of individuals that can mate and produce viable offspring. And what I mean by that is those offspring can also have offspring. So they're able to produce fertile offspring and pass on the genetics of the parents. So yes, certain things can mate, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they'll produce viable offspring. And once they do, that is the key definition, the key answer to knowing you have a new species. So what is speciation? Well, speciation is the process of creating a new species. And this usually happens with divergent evolution. So you had a common ancestor, and then over time, the populations diverged, they split off. And there's a number of ways to cause populations to split. But then over time, they adapt to their new environments. And once you bring those populations back together, they no longer want to breed. And of course, as soon as that happens, you have now created a new species. So the process of speciation can actually be quite slow. And this is something that Darwin described a long time ago in his Origin of Species book. So he said that over time species do change, and this slow change is what we now call gradualism. So the change that's occurring in populations, it tends to be slow, constant, and consistent. But then other scientists came along and said that this process can also be very fast, and it can be illustrated with the fossil record. So they were able to see that there were bursts of change followed by very calm periods of time. And then you saw all of a sudden a whole bunch of changes and then calm. And usually those changes were brought about by a rapid environmental change. So something happened in the environment which caused the change to occur. This idea is called punctuated equilibrium, and it was brought about by two scientists named Eldridge and Gould. So again, what could cause these sudden bursts of change with species? Well, definitely something in the environment had to suddenly change as well. And when you get these sudden changes in the environment, it leads to more available niches. So niches are, if you forgot, an organism's job or role. So if an environmental change happens where it kind of eliminates certain species, it could also open up different jobs or available niches to newer species, and then you get a sudden change happening in those populations. I also want you to keep in mind that speciation is the reason why we have so many different species here on Earth. So again, the idea we had a common ancestor, and then through time and all these environmental changes, we had a whole bunch of new species created throughout time. Something that can create speciation and cause populations to actually separate is the idea of geographic isolation. So say you had a population and for some reason, some way geographically, it was split. So maybe like a river formed or some mountains formed, a canyon, and it split the populations in two. Well, over time, those populations will adapt to those environmental conditions in which they are faced. And over time, what may happen is that those populations become isolated from one another. They've changed so much. So now when you bring them back, they no longer want to mate. And so you have just created two species there through geographic isolation. Sometimes you do see this in what's called allopatric speciation. So if you see here in the picture, you have a lake with a fish, right? They're kind of brownish in color. And then if they do get geographically separated, we call that allopatric speciation that can take place. But sometimes what's really crazy is that speciation will take place even though there is no geographic barrier. And we call that sympatric speciation. Another thing that could cause the separation of populations is reproductive isolation. And in reproductive isolation, you have barriers that actually stop two species from producing viable, fertile offspring. And these barriers are usually biological in nature. There's two different kinds. We have prezygotic barriers and postzygotic barriers. So let's go ahead and talk about each of those. A general example of reproductive isolation occurs in wheat. So for example, wheat comes in different forms and they have more than just one set of chromosomes. So they are actually polyploid in nature. So for example, there are diploid sets of wheat where they have two sets of chromosomes. There's some that are tetraploid, so they have four sets like durum or macaroni wheat. And then bread wheat, for example, is actually hexaploid. It has six sets of chromosomes. And because they have all of these different numbers of chromosomes, they won't interbreed with one another. So you can grow durum wheat next to bread wheat and not worry about the two populations crossing because their chromosome numbers don't match up. So a prezygotic barrier is a barrier to reproducing that is created before the organism tries to mate. So for example, if the populations are isolated from each other based on their habitat, that would be a prezygotic barrier. If they mate at different times of the year, that's obviously a barrier. Sometimes they have different mating rituals or behaviors, so that would impede reproducing. And then lastly, sometimes there are mechanical differences or shape differences on the morphologies that would lead to no mating. There are also postzygotic barriers that are in place to ensure that even if a zygote is created, a viable adult will not be created. So for example, what you're looking at right here is a liger. It's a mix, it's a hybrid of a lion and a tiger. However, this hybrid is not a viable offspring. It cannot reproduce. Sometimes what you see with hybrids, if you see two species mating and producing a zygote, they tend to be frail or weak, or they are sterile, so they can't necessarily have offspring. As you may know, extinction occurs when a species disappears, and a species often disappears when there's ecological stress. So something happens in the environment and it causes organisms to be stressed and die out. There are a number of things that are currently going on in our environment that are causing extinction, so let's go ahead and take a look at some of these. One of the things that can cause ecological stress is habitat loss of organisms or habitat fragmentation. What you are seeing here is a good example of habitat fragmentation. This occurs when usually development comes in and they leave a little parcel or patch of natural land. However, that land is not connected to any other patches, so populations become fragmented or separated from other populations in the area. Sometimes hunting and poaching can lead to stress on organisms. Poaching is usually the killing of an organism for something that the organism has on it. So for example, a lot of times people will like to poach bear paws from bears and use them for different purposes. Also, for example, like rhinos are often poached for their horns and they're ground down to make medicines. Another thing that is still currently happening is that elephants are being poached for their ivory on their tusks. And so they are usually harvested illegally and used to make different ornamental objects. And yet another example of poaching is that of cat skins. So whether it be a cheetah or a tiger, like you see here in these pictures, people will usually poach these animals in order to obtain their fur to be used for decorative purposes. Another phenomenon that can cause ecological stress is overfishing. So our appetite for fish has grown over the years, especially since it's seen as the healthier option for eating meat. And our overtaking of species has led to definitely the commercial extinction of some species, but over time we'll see more and more of them becoming commercially extinct. Now, in history, there have been about 5 major mass extinctions, and you can see each of them here on the geological time scale. When these extinctions happened afterwards, you had a whole bunch of available niches open up. And so usually what you saw is, yeah, there was a period of downtime where species were not as abundant, but they did rebound eventually to the levels that they were at. It is currently thought that we are in the 6th mass extinction, and that is being caused by humans and their interactions with the environment, not necessarily things that are occurring from space and so forth. But like I was just saying, there is a positive note to extinctions when they occur naturally. Extinctions do open up more niches, more available jobs, and that leads to new species being created or species changing to fill those niches. So it is a good thing, but definitely not a good thing right now. All right, well, that concludes our talk on speciation and extinction, and I'll see you guys in a sec.